Simone de Beauvoir's Second Sex is a particularly influential work for second wave feminists. If you're not familiar, first wave feminists are largely considered those that were interested in increasing suffrage, so increasing access to the political mechanisms of our society, so the right to vote, reducing legal constrictions or restrictions on women's um, ability to participate in society, whereas second wave feminism really focuses on more social aspects, issues of the family for sure, but also issues of social relations more broadly construed. And Simone de Beauvoir's Second Sex is um, really notable, at least for our purposes, for introducing the distinction between sex and gender. And that's largely what we're going to be focusing on with Simone de Beauvoir, and then thinking about how that might be used by Sally Haslinger, and then critiqued by people like Butler, at least according to Austa. So Simone de Beauvoir starts this selection by saying, look, we're commonly told as women to be a woman, to stay a woman, or to become women. And this suggests that the way that we talk about being a gender means that it's really something other than being sex. Because not every female human being is necessarily a woman on this account. If you must become a woman or be a woman or stay a woman, we start realizing that woman becomes something like a regulatory ideal for, at least in Beauvoir's case, for females. She wants to say that we should reject essentialism. So this idea that there's this essence that all women have, that these essences are immutable or unchangeable or permanent, should really be jumped. We shouldn't believe in essences at all. Why? Well, if you look at biology and social sciences, they have long given up this idea that there is a primary essence of, say, blackness or Jewishness. So why not we think that there is one for womanness? And we should also not reject, in rejecting essentialism, we should not subscribe to nominalism. The idea that women are just those who are arbitrarily designated by the word woman. She thinks that this falls short because it's easy for anti-feminists to say, no, no, look, women are different from men. And further, no woman can claim without bad faith to be situated beyond her sex. Much of the, at least the early chapters of this book, and even in the later ones where she's talking about the development of a person into being a woman, much of it is focused around the sexed experience, the experience of having a female body. So she wants to say, look, it's obvious. Anyone can clearly see that humanity is split into two categories of individuals with manifestly different clothes, faces, bodies, smiles, movements, interests, and occupations. These differences are perhaps superficial, perhaps they are destined to disappear, but what is certain is that for the moment, they exist in a strikingly obvious way. So the puzzle that she wants to raise is that if female function is not enough to define a woman, and if we also reject the explanation of this eternal feminine essence, but we accept even temporarily that there are women on Earth, then we have to ask the question, what is a woman? She suggests some defining characteristics of being a woman. So women are presented as, quote, negative. Man is always considered the default, whereas woman is considered a lack or as suffering some kind of natural defect compared with men. This is also present in a lot of different philosophy that she's drawing from, which you can see her citations in if you go revisit the work. Women are presented, or the fact that one is a woman is presented as a liability. It is, say, the reason why women think the things they do, whereas men are presented as rational, as universal, as the default. Men on this account don't have to think about their gender as disrupting these capacities. In fact, it's considered a boon to those capacities, whereas for women, being a woman is something that has to be overcome in order to be thinking rationally or to be considered from the universal perspective. And by universal perspective, just that when things are said by men or are considered from a man or male perspective, that those are considered default or there's some kind of epistemic privilege that men have that women do not. Women are also considered embodied in a way that men aren't, at least according to her. So a woman has ovaries and a uterus, and these are particular conditions that lock her into her subjectivity. Men, rather, are unconstrained by their bodies, freed to pursue their autonomous goals. If you look at her discussion of childhood, and especially her discussion of development through puberty, she makes this point explicit. Women are also presented as an other. So men see her essentially as a sexed being. For him, she is just sex. So she is it really in the absolute. She is determined and differentiated in relation to men. While he is not in relation to her, she is the inessential in front of the essential. He is the subject, he is the absolute, whereas she is the other. So what she's trying to suggest here is that women don't have as near much of agency as men, and women are often just seen or just reduced to their capacity to provide sex, or their capacity to, we'll see later in the course, provide other kinds of feminine coded goods. Being a woman is also tied with dominance and relations of dominance and domination. Women have been particularly dominated in the history of human society. In many other oppressions, there is usually considered a before, a past where that oppression did not exist. But as she suggests, for women, there was not one event, but really a whole historical development that explains their existence as a class and accounts for the distribution of these individuals in this class. There's, for example, not always been proletarians. This is the class, of course, that Marxists point out as being important for political discussion. But there have always been women. They are women by their physiological structure. As far back as history can be traced, they have always been subordinate to men, and their dependence is not the consequence of an event or a becoming. It didn't just happen, it just always has been. And I want us to think, when you think about this stuff a little bit more, I want you to keep this in mind for when we discuss or when you look at Sally Haslinger's work. Because for her, she's going to really take this point and push it to just be the defining feature of being a woman as a social class. For Beauvoir, women don't even dream of exterminating their oppressors. The woman is the other at the heart of a whole whose two components are necessary to each other. So this seems somewhat heteronormative, I think. But the idea here is that women are so dependent on men. John Stuart Mill makes the same point in Subjection of Women, but this idea that women are so dependent on men that they don't have the choice to, say, destroy their oppressors in the way that, say, the proletariat have a choice or an ability to destroy the bourgeoisie, or that oppressed Black folk or people of color have to destroy the oppressor. There's this real sense that women are always going to have to live with men. At least that's the theme that she's getting at here. We're not going to go into it too much, but later in the development of feminism, there's also lesbian separatist movements, which suggest, no, we as women also should be allowed, or we should think or imagine or idealize or live in separatist communities where it's just women. And that's a way to get away from some of this kind of fatalism that Simone de Beauvoir expresses. Now, women might be dependent on men forever, and men, you might say, are dependent on women as well. She wants to suggest that, look, biological dependency of men on women hasn't really liberated women. If anything, it has made women more subjected to men's desire. Now, one might suggest or ask, well, why haven't women liberated themselves if this is such a bad outcome or a bad situation? And she says, well, women make no claims for herself as a subject because she lacks the concrete means, because she senses the necessary link connecting her to man without positing its reciprocity, and because she often derives satisfaction from her role as the other. So there's a couple things going on here. The first is that she lacks the ability to, the concrete means, And this is a large theme or a very present theme in second wave feminism. The desire to have financial independence, for example, is required for women to liberate themselves from the oppression of men or oppression by men. But there's also the sense of a necessary link connecting her to a man, without the idea of needing reciprocity. So there's this kind of abnegation that goes on here, that women might give up their demand for being treated as full persons. And also because there are pleasures from being in the role as an other. She wants to say that this is largely due to socialization within society, that women have been trained or are trained or pressured into taking on this role of the other, taking on this maybe submissive role or subject-oriented role, as you're subjected to, sorry, not subject-oriented, other-oriented or object-oriented role, where you are an object for someone else's pleasure, that your gains in life, your social status, etc., should be tailored to not your own achievements, but the achievements of a man. There are also reasons that men might be threatened by equality, and she goes through some of these, not in a lot of detail, but I think they're worth pointing out. If women get equality, that might be a threat to morality or the system of morality, the system of moral obligations that women have to maybe their children or to their spouses. There might also be a fear of competition. So, for example, if a woman enters the workforce, then that will drive down the wages of men that are similarly situated in the workforce. As well, men might just have feelings of entitlement, that if someone else, a woman, gets a job that they think that they're entitled to, that they think that a woman should be stepping aside from those positions. Or there might just be feelings of superiority, that men are just superior to women and therefore do not deserve any kind of equality. And she stresses that for even the moderate man, so someone who, at least on the surface, sounds like they might be supportive of equality, she wants to say that it's still challenging for them. There remains a myth of the woman that most men subscribe to. Quote, they know what they lose by relinquishing the woman of their dreams, but they do not know what the woman of tomorrow will bring him. So it takes great abnegation to refuse to posit oneself as a unique and absolute subject. It's very appealing, it's very alluring in that way. She continues, besides, the vast majority of men do not explicitly make this position their own. They do not posit women as inferior. They are too imbued today with the democratic ideal not to recognize all humans as equals. Within the family, the male child and then the young man sees the woman as having the same social dignity as the adult male. Afterward, he experiences in desire and love the resistance and independence of the desired and loved woman. Married, he respects in his wife the spouse and the mother. And in the concrete experience of married life, she affirms herself opposite him as a freedom. Him as like fully free. He can thus convince himself that there is no longer a social hierarchy between the sexes, and that on the whole, in spite of their differences, women is equal, just differently. As he nevertheless recognizes some points of inferiority, professional incapacity being the predominant one, he attributes those to nature. When he has an attitude of benevolence and partnership towards a woman, he applies the principle of abstract equality, and he does not posit the concrete equality he recognizes. But as soon as he clashes with her, the situation is reversed. He will apply the concrete inequality theme and will even allow himself to disavow abstract equality. This is how many men affirm with quasi-good faith that women are equal to men and have no demands to make, and at the same time that women will never be equal to men and that their demands are in vain. It is difficult for men to measure the enormous extent of social discrimination that seems insignificant from the outside and whose moral and intellectual repercussions are so deep in women that they appear to spring from an original nature. The man most sympathetic to women never knows her concrete situation fully. So she suggests there's no good reason to believe men, when they try to defend the privileges whose scope they cannot even fathom. We will not let ourselves be intimidated by the number and violence of attacks against women, nor be fooled by the self-serving praise showered on the real woman, nor be won over by men's enthusiasm for her destiny, a destiny they would not for the world want to share. One element here is that she wants to suggest that women have a particular epistemic authority when it comes to their own oppression. And that's something that I want to just flag for something that will come about to later. That she wants to say that there is something about living the woman's experience that it gives you a kind of privileged position. But there are some caveats for her. So she thinks that men can't be trusted to know women's circumstances or to be able to answer what a woman is, because of the reasons that I just gave in that long, extended continuation of the quote that I just read. And not all women are in a position to do so, she thinks. And neither are what she calls hermaphrodites, which I assume she means what we would call intersex folks today. She wants to say that intersex folks are a case of their own. Now, just set that aside for a moment. We'll visit some of those ideas later in the course, perhaps next week. But certain women, women like her, that have been given the privileges of the human being, can be afforded the luxury of impartiality. So she wants to say that people that have had the kind of education that she's had, women that have had the experience for kind of unique experience of having been to a large extent liberated, those women have the privileges of having the embodied insight of a woman, but also the intellectual capacities to be reasonable or rational. She's not trying to say that women by their nature are unreasonable or irrational, but certainly in the context of our current social climate, or her current social climate, women have not been afforded the conceptual tools or the concrete means to be able to have this kind of objectivity. I just want to make it clear that that's what she's talking about. So here's a discussion of biology. The selection that I had you read comes after a very long discussion on the differences between different sexes in other animals. And what she wants to say there, basically, is that things are wildly divergent from the way that we experience it with humans. There's such a diversity in the way that animals procreate, what kind of roles they take on, what kind of social hierarchies that they have, what kind of principles go into having sex and reproducing, that it's very hard to say that there is some natural order where everywhere and always the female is always subjugated to the male. For her, biology is very important. It is an essential element of women's situation. That's the section that we get to, what I had you read. She, in an extended quote, she says, "The body is an instrument of our hold on the world. The world appears different to us depending on how it is grasped, which explains why we have studied these data so deeply. They are one of the keys that enable us to understand women. But we refuse the idea that they form a fixed destiny for her." So this is a key claim that she makes for the work. "Those natural facts do not suffice to constitute or make the basis for a sexual hierarchy or an ordering between the privileges and rights of one group over another. They do not explain why the woman is the other. They do not condemn her forever to this subjugated role." So there's little behind thinking of a hierarchy amongst the sexes. Pick your standard of what counts as strong, powerful, weak, etc. These all depend on the social significance we give to these standards. So in the section that I'm reading for you now, I have not reproduced it in my notes, but you can find it in the selection. She says, "In truth, these facts cannot be denied." So the sexual facts. "But they do not carry their meaning in themselves. As soon as we accept a human perspective, defining the body starting from existence, biology becomes an abstract science. When the physiological given, say muscular inferiority, takes on meaning, this meaning immediately becomes dependent on a whole context. Weakness is weakness only in light of the aims that humans have set for themselves, the instruments at their disposal, and the laws that they impose. If he did not want to apprehend the world, the very idea of a grasp on things would have no meaning. When in this apprehension the full use of body force above the usable minimum is not required, the differences cancel each other out. Where customs forbid violence, muscular energy cannot be the basis for domination. Existential, economic, and moral reference points are necessary to define the notion of weakness completely. It has been said that the human species was an antithesis. The expression is not really exact because men cannot possibly contradict the given. Okay, but it is in how he takes it on that he constitutes its truth. Nature only has reality for us insofar as it is taken on by our action. Our own nature is no exception. And it's not possible to measure in the abstract the burden of the generative function for women, just as it's not possible to measure her grasp on the world. The relation of maternity to individual life is naturally regulated in animals by the cycle of heat and seasons. It is undefined for women. Only society can decide. Women's enslavement to the species, that is to biology, is tighter or looser depending on how many births the society demands and the hygienic conditions in which pregnancy and birth occur. So if it can be said that among the higher animals, individual existence is affirmed more imperiously in the man than in the female. In humanity, individual possibilities ultimately depend on the economic and social situation. What she wants to say is, at least in response to this idea that women are more beholden to their bodies. In our common day expressions, you might hear this in the context when someone says, you're only going through that experience because it must be your time of the month. That kind of idea is tailoring someone's experience of maybe a wrong that's been done or a complaint that might be valid and relegating it to the consequence of someone's biology. There are plenty of other ways people might be tied to their biology or be not, I don't mean tied in a natural way, but tied in a social way. Our discussion of the trans, well, there's no the trans experience, but trans experiences next week will shed some light on this. For our part here, it's important to recognize that she's pointing out the social is ultimately what gives meaning to all these sex differences that we find. Even the idea of strength and weakness that only comes into presence when for some reason we've decided to exert our strength over a common or normal use of our bodies. So when we say have contests, like athletic contests, for example. But generally speaking, these differences all wash out unless we push ourselves in those ways. Now, if we do make distinctions based on biology, and we do say, hey, look, women are biologically inferior to men, she suggests that we're failing to recognize that women haven't even reached their full potential biologically. I mean, generally speaking, for her, women are in her time, and even somewhat today, women are not particularly told or supported or rewarded for partaking in activities that men tend to pursue. So athletics would be one of them. And so her point is like, well, if you really wanted to say that there are these distinctions in biology, then you'd have to allow there to be equality to see whether women can reach their full potential and whether that potential would meet or exceed or be less than man's, or in this case, males. Who takes most care of productive and reproductive forces, she also points out, is different depending on the different economic moments of human history. So society is not always distributed all the different reproductive and productive cares that we see in the time that she's writing in the 40s. It largely depends on the social aspects of what's going on. So furthermore, society is itself not a, quote, species. Women's enslavement to the species, this is her idea of saying, or her way of saying, women's enslavement to demands of biology, and the limits of her individual abilities are facts of extreme importance. So this is true. The woman's body is one of the essential elements of the situation she occupies in the world. But her body is not enough to define her. The question is what humanity has made of the human female. And this is the underlying big upshot of her view here. We can continue. Well, I'll get there in a second. But the idea that the significance of sex is largely decided by society. And what we call gender is that social significance of what sex is. So she doesn't want to deny that a woman's particular experience as a female interacts with the way that she sees herself, the way that she experiences the world, and it may be fundamentally different than a male's. But the social meaning behind that is another story entirely. She has this famous quote, I'm not sure if you've heard of it, but perhaps. One is not born, but rather becomes a woman. No biological, psychic, or economic destiny defines the figure that the human female takes on in society. If you want to read more about Simone de Beauvoir or read more of Second Sex, you can look at this. We're not going to read much more than what we've read today. This quote is taken from the chapter called Childhood, where she goes into the kind of socializing aspects of what it is to become a woman and what women are required or asked to be. For our purposes, we're just trying to understand, what is this thing, gender? And for her, gender is a social category. We make people women and men in society. And for her, importantly, it's the social meaning that we ascribe to sex. Sex itself is a biological category. And for Simone de Beauvoir, it is a given. While it's certainly an important component of what it is to be a woman, just being female does not make you a woman. And this can go for men as well. Just being a male does not make you a man. The man and the woman, the gender part, that stuff is how society has interpreted these biological features of different bodies, otherwise known as sex. This idea we'll see taken up by Sally Haslinger, and we'll see that it's been criticized by Butler and Osta, as well as lots of trans scholars, and we'll see that in the next week. But for now, this is the idea that we want to derive from Beauvoir.